The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the ECAT staff or board of directors.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi everybody, my name is Peter Evers and welcome to Humanity First. This week we are going to talk about some words that have taken on a different meaning, at least in some places in the United States, and that is diversity, equity, and inclusion. There have been so many changes with the federal government, with executive orders coming out over the past 6 months or so. And what we're going to do today is we're going to talk with Felicia Heywood, who is our Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Executive Vice President here at BAMSI, and get her take on where we are now and why an organization like BAMSI still needs to think about and promote the idea of equity. Because if we're talking about equity, we're not breaking the law. If we're not talking about equity, we run the risk of breaking the law. So we're just going to break that down a little bit. And we're going to talk about where we are and where we're going and what optimism we might have around what is going on in this country. So stick around. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm an essential worker here at BAMSI, and I'm a nurse. Nurses are essential here at BAMSI because as nurses, we really have the opportunity to make an impact. We have very small ratios, so we have the opportunity to really learn everything about the person served and be able to give the best care. It really serves such a great purpose for me as being a nurse and really why I came into nursing. Learn more about nursing opportunities at bamsijobs.org.
Giving a voice to the voiceless, pulling stories out of the shadows and putting them under the spotlight, making sure that each person is valued and cared for. This is Humanity First with Peter Evers, presented by BAMSI.
Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Humanity First. As promised in the top of the show, we have a guest who is not, is somebody who's been on this show. What would you say, Felicia? About 3 times? Yeah. And this might be your 4th. So Felicia Heywood, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
And anybody who listens to the show will know that Felicia is our Executive Vice President of DASIA, as we call it, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, Justice, and Accessibility. Some might say we're a bit brave having this conversation, I guess, which is a bit of a strange thing to say, Felicia. But, I would start maybe by just telling whoever's listening to the show a little bit about BAMSI relative to diversity. This is an organization that is deeply rooted in the community of Brockton and around in the southeast Massachusetts area. And it's probably one of the more diverse human service organizations in Massachusetts, I would say. About 75% of the people that work at BAMSI, which is about 1,700 people, are BIPOC, and many of those people are coming to us as new Americans. So let's go back a couple of years to when you started here in this position, which was a position that was created with you in mind, of course.
Certainly.
Tell us a bit about that when you were taking on this, because I think that you've been around in social work for a while and done a lot of things, from residential work to working in communities. What attracted you to that position as you came in?
Sure. And I think I'll talk about what attracted me to BAMSI in this position, which was to say that, following the murder of George Floyd in 2020, organizations across the globe were issuing these Black Lives Matters, and we believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like, a lot of people were making statements like that. BAMSI was no different. However, BAMSI was different in one way. There was a line in the declaration that BAMSI released that spoke to, we recognize that we have unintentionally promoted systems or may have practices that continue to promote oppression. And we promise to do better, to look at this and to do better. And so for me, as someone who does this work professionally, that was just amazing to see. A lot of people were claiming things like Black Lives Matters as though it was something they cared about out there. Mm-hmm. What was different about BAMSI is BAMSI had it out there, but also said, and we need to look at ourselves as well. and manage how we've been working through the world. And that was frankly very exciting to see.
Yeah, and obviously we're a minority, an MBE as they call it, which gives us status as a minority agency, and we had a board that was majority minority, and so it made perfect sense for us to do that and to really importantly, I think, make a statement for the people who worked with us, right? That we wanted to stand behind the idea of equity and the idea of justice, which those, although we're having a different conversation about it with a difficult time, I think, for human service agencies, those values have not changed, right?
No, they haven't. In fact, what I think is interesting, and maybe what you're referring to a little about being brave, is, we're currently in an environment where the words diversity, equity, inclusion have been shortened to an acronym and cast as possibly illegal, which couldn't be the farthest thing from the truth. The work of diversity, equity, inclusion is actually the most legal work you can be doing. It is the way to prevent the unlawful discrimination, right? Yeah. That leaves us vulnerable to lawsuits or losing funding and things like that. So in that way, the values persist, and what feels so urgent to do is to persist in that work and not be fooled into thinking there's something wrong with promoting equity for all.
Right. That's it. Somebody on the radio once said, just say the words, don't say the letters. And that really struck me as something if you say you're against diversity, equity, inclusion, it sounds a little odd, doesn't it? And perhaps illegal.
It might. It's interesting because there's also been the conversation that maybe we could continue the work, but let's call it something else, right? And I struggle with that because I do believe that over the course of human history, especially in this country, starting with the Civil Rights Act, people have struggled in this work. And the words diversity, equity, inclusion have come to be a beacon of sorts, right? So I'm very hesitant to relinquish that language.
Right.
And I don't think we need to. I think it is not in the words. I think it is in clarifying what the work is, which maybe we haven't been forced to do prior. So in some ways, this is great. It's forcing us to really lean in. What is it that we do? And to take it out of sort of the myths that are being cast about it. So the words and the values persist, and they are as legal as anything could possibly be. And totally in keeping with the ethos of our country.
Right. And imagine being somebody who is working for us at the moment. And so many of our staff are from Haiti, for instance. So many of our staff are from Africa. These are countries that are under attack at the moment. And I'm not just talking about citizen status. I'm talking about some of the things that are said about Somalians, for instance, which has been in the news lately. So for us to back away from these values and even the language, how is that going to sound to somebody who's, third shift on a Tuesday night, who's got 3 jobs to support a family in a housing market that is overboiling? How does that sound?
Yeah, I think that's such an important question, and I think one that we struggled with, especially when the executive orders started coming out. I was very proud to be at an agency. We were ready with language on day one, assuring folks who were from strategically marginalized communities that we stood firm in these principles and we weren't going to abandon them. We weren't going to abandon those people who are, generally speaking, because we are a diverse agency. But like so many, we are diverse at the front lines, right? A lot of brown and black, a lot of women. And then as you get closer and closer to the CEO, right, it turns a lot lighter and a lot more male-centered. And so, the people that are out there doing the work are also the most vulnerable among us. And so it felt so important to assure them that we weren't going to abandon them.
Right. And part of the work that we do is so dependent on a workforce that is able to do the job, right? We're working with very vulnerable populations who are often from those underrepresented economic groups. And so having that line of justice right through what we do, from the contracts that we have to the power which we give to people. I was thinking about somebody the other day was talking about one of our programs, and they said, a year ago, before I began treatment, I couldn't have had a conversation with anybody about my mental health because it was too painful and I was too literally suicidal. it's those values and that training that brings people forward, doesn't it? And I always say treatment works, and treatment works if it's culturally appropriate. Treatment works if it's evidence-based practices. All those things are in the mix, right?
Yeah. And I think also, so this is the other part of the diversity, equity, inclusion work that to me is part of how that is getting marginalized, which is people tend to think it's about, generally speaking in this country, a black and white issue, right? Which is to discount gender, sexual orientation, disability status. So one of the things I've been struck by that we are really working to shift in our own agency is the degree to which the people who work for BAMSI are comfortable disclosing their own disabilities and having that be something that we're working with, right? And we lose some of that in the rhetoric, right? When the policy has become politicized, we're losing some of those distinctions, about diversity, equity, inclusion work, first of all, is work for every single body, right? If you are human and alive, you are diverse. You are part of our diverse community. And our work should be to ensure that you can bring your fullest self, whether it's a disability, your sexual orientation, or your gender orientation, to the workplace and use all of the skills that come with that in service of the people we support.
And it's so that the logic to that model is that you're going to get the best out of people if they feel comfortable. You're going to get the best out of the treatment if people look like the people who are providing treatment. And at orientation, every time we do it, we say everybody in this agency has the same opportunities. And we struggle to make that so. And actually saying that to people, how could that be anything else than equitable? And equity is what we strive for, right?
I mean, yes, it should be. I think, again, when we're in a time when, basic principles have become politicized, it's a little challenging. So that's part of this sort of, you talked about logic. We're in an illogical time in some ways, right? And so when we're talking about being able to bring the best of yourself to work, of course that makes the most sense. And of course you're going to get the best yield out of people who feel fully available to do the work. And that's what's been interesting about this misunderstanding of these executive orders, for instance, which is, if people read it very carefully, it talks about illegal DEI practices. Well, a thoughtfully constructed diversity, equity, inclusion best practice plan is, again, the most legal thing. You are fighting discrimination literally. So I think this idea that leaning in is somehow about raising some people up to the detriment of others is absolutely a false narrative that's being promoted for political reasons. There's nothing illegal. A well-constructed diversity, equity, inclusion project is about level setting. It's about looking at, all things being equal, we'd expect representation from all sorts of people. And if we're not seeing that representation, what's inhibiting it? What are the barriers to full participation? And looking at those barriers. So it's not really about lifting some people up and pushing others down. It's about getting a level set for everyone.
So give me an example then of, I think about universities and what pressure they've been under from the Trump administration. Give me an example of an illegal DEI process. And then I guess we could argue that we're against that too, right?
Yes, we absolutely are. And it's funny. So I'll answer your question and then I'll tell a little story. But one example that I use quite frequently is referencing the fact that in 1970, here in this country, in the U.S., less than 5% of the musicians at the top symphony orchestras in the country were women. Less than 5%. So clearly there's something interesting because more than 5% of the population is women. So what's going on there? In a legal way of doing it, sort of an old-fashioned way, might it be like thinking about affirmative action, just looking at diversity, just hire more women. Yeah. Just solve the problem by hiring more women, right? Well, that might look like we solved the problem, but it hasn't really addressed any of the main issues. So another way of looking at it and how we look at things at BAMSI is to say, well, what is leading to this disparity, right? This unexpected outcome? Are there factors in recruitment? Are there factors in the audition process? Are there factors in people not seeing women, so not thinking there should be women? So, and then you look at sort of what are the barriers inhibiting the full participation, and you address those barriers, right? So to just put people in roles because you want the numbers to balance out, that's quite illegal. Yeah, right. We don't do that.
And that backfires on you. To your point, and I'm going to a ridiculous degree here, but what happens if you took 10 women who didn't play instruments and put them in the orchestra.
You'd have a pretty interesting orchestra.
Right. But then what does a male-dominated society say about that?
We shouldn't have hired those women. They're not as talented.
Exactly
right.
right.
It backfires.
So it really is looking at the root causes and beginning to create an equitable field. More than that, obviously, but I think that dispels so many of these myths that are out there that have been fostered by this administration, and they continue to do. I guess I'm always looking for optimism, and there is optimism here, as far as I'm concerned. Somebody once said to me, it was my dad actually, he said, just decide what your principles are, decide what your core beliefs are, and just stick to them, and you'll be fine. Now, we know through history that hasn't always been fine for people who have been persecuted. But when we think about this, when some agencies have sort of rushed to change language, which some of them did, some of those progressive left-wing organizations or liberal organizations made that decision. Was that wrong?
I don't really work in right and wrong, as you know, especially not in this work. People made the choices they make. And what I think is important is for folks who are in a position and able to sort of say the truth, for those people and organizations to say the truth. Some organizations are more vulnerable than others. Yep. Not everybody has the ability to just say, we're going to stand firm. Mm-hmm. We're going to double down, right? So I don't know that I'd say they're wrong. And when you talk about a silver lining, I often think that part of the silver lining to this time we're in really is this push for refinement, right? This push for, once upon a time, we looked at the things that were imbalanced and we said, just balance them. And that's really all we wanted, just balance them. And it didn't work well, and it hasn't worked well. So really this idea of like being hard pressed to define your work, to define the legality of your work is actually a boon, I think, for people who are doing this work.
No, I think that's absolutely true. And of course, it's so much more than this. But, when I think about gains, and I always remember that one of the newsreaders on ABC or something after Barack Obama was elected, they said, are we now entering a post-racial society? Which always sort of sticks in my mind. It's like, I didn't get that one particularly right. But there were gains there. Mm-hmm. And if you go back to Reconstruction, if you go back to most things that are hard earned, there is a retrenchment sometimes from the dominant paradigm. And that's maybe where we're at the moment. But what prevails in the end is justice in a democracy. And I think that's the optimism that I bring. And an organization like ours is bound and determined to stick to those principles because of who we are, who we employ, and who we provide services for.
Absolutely. And I think, as you were speaking, Peter, it really occurred to me that part of it as well is this is another opportunity to look at who we left out of the conversation, right? It's not a zero-sum game. Equity is not a zero-sum game, but it has been talked about as though it were. And so some people have experienced those gains as losses. Yeah. And we haven't attended to that in a way with real integrity. Right. And we've left that behind. And then we find ourselves here and we're like, how did this happen? Right. Well, we left a whole group of people out of this conversation. Right. We didn't show them how this benefits them. They really only saw what felt like loss.
That's right.
And we haven't allowed for grieving. Yeah. Right.
And those losses, I think, were sort of taken on by those folks. I think about somebody once said to me, don't talk to me about white privilege if you're a strip miner in Appalachia. And we can argue about white privilege all day or these things, but I think that's what you're sort of getting at in some ways, because people listen to certain messages, and the messages of fear and loathing are very, very strong right now. And this isn't America. This is in Europe. This is all over the world. And again, I think that's part of the retrenchment of the advance that we've had. It's a long road, and my optimism says we'll be back on that road eventually.
The pendulum always swings.
Yeah.
And I hope that when as we're moving back to some equilibrium, regaining some steps, that we remember that sense of loss for some folks. To say to a manager who's always hired a certain way and no one's ever raised an eyebrow, suddenly to say, there's some bias in your hiring practice, it can be a lot. So you got to bring that in as well.
Yeah, I remember when we did the bias work, it was so helpful for you to say, well, these are mine, and that doesn't make me a lesser person. It actually makes me a person, right?
Makes me a person with a brain that works, right? Because that's what your brains do. And if anyone's listening, this one thing, I'll get on one soapbox. If you are alive and your brain is working in some way, shape, or form, you have biases. Our brains have to make shortcuts. Yeah. And that's where biases are created. Yeah. It's just a function of our brain. Right.
At some point, somebody will talk about a saber-toothed tiger, I should think.
I'm ready.
Felicia, thank you so much. We've run out of time.
Thank you.
As ever, we could, I think, talk about this topic and many others for hours and hours on end. And I'm sure, hopefully, you'll come back on the show again in a couple of months, something like that. And we'll see where we are.
I'd love that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.